I stepped onto the football pitch, the familiar smell of fresh-cut grass hitting me. Summer had been all about pushing myself to the limit, shaking off the sting of last season's loss. I was ready, focused. At least I thought I was until I saw him. Kenneth Pratt, my ex. My coach now, apparently. He stood by the goalposts, arms crossed, scanning the team like he owned the place. 3 years, and I thought I'd buried that part of my life. Guess not. My heart started racing, but not because of the game. I pulled on my cleats, keeping my eyes anywhere but on him, but when his voice cut through the air low, authoritative, calling out orders, I couldn't ignore it. That voice once whispered things only we knew. Now it commanded the field. Benjamin, you're slacking. Step it up. His eyes locked with mine for a second. Cold. He was calling me out in front of everyone. I swallowed the urge to say something smart back. I jogged off to the side, muscles burning with frustration. This wasn't part of the plan. Facing Kenneth was the last thing I needed, but ignoring him wasn't an option either. As practice ended, I tried to slip away unnoticed, but as luck would have it, Kenneth was waiting near the benches, leaning against the wall like he hadn't been drilling me in front of the team all day. Benny said, his voice calm now, too calm, a word. I kept my distance, not looking him in the eye. What do you want? Coach, the word felt strange coming out of my mouth, but I forced it. The others were still milling around, grabbing their stuff, but they were close enough to hear. I didn't need this getting weird. Kenneth's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. We need to talk about your performance. You're out of shape. I snorted, shaking my head. Out of shape? Really? That's what you want to talk about? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You know that's not it. You're distracted. I crossed my arms, the tension thick enough to choke on. What do you expect, Kenneth? I didn't ask for this, you showing up here. I didn't know you'd be. Neither did I, he cut in, his tone sharp, but there was something else under it. Regret, maybe? But we're here now. I glanced around, making sure no one was paying attention, then took a step forward, closing the gap between us. Look, I don't need a coach breathing down my neck, especially not you. He raised an eyebrow, eyes narrowing. Especially not me, huh? Still running, I see. That hit harder than I'd expected. I clenched my fists but kept my voice steady. I'm not running. Kenneth didn't say anything, just stared at me like he was seeing through all the bullshit. I hated that he still had that power over me. Even after all this time, he turned to leave but threw one last glance over his shoulder. Prove it? Then he didn't wait for a response before walking away, leaving me standing there, pulse pounding, wondering what the hell he really wanted from me. As I watched him go, I couldn't help but think, maybe I didn't hate this reunion as much as I pretended to. The next day, I hit the field determined to focus. No more distractions. No more letting Kenneth get in my head. But of course, he didn't make that easy. Benjamin... Again, Kenneth barked as I fumbled a pass during drills. His voice cut through the air sharp, loud enough for the whole team to hear. I grit my teeth, nodding as I got back in position. As we reset, I could feel his eyes on me. Not like before, when he used to watch me with that soft smile or a look that said more than words ever could. Now it was different. He was studying me, pushing me like he was daring me to screw up again. I didn't. Not this time. The ball came, I trapped it cleanly and sent it to Liam, our winger, with precision. But as soon as I did, I heard Kenneth's voice again, this time quieter but just as cutting. Better, he muttered, walking past me close enough for his shoulder to brush mine, but not good enough. I spun, couldn't stop myself. What's your problem, Kenneth? He stopped, not turning around right away, just standing there like he was waiting for me to say more. I didn't. I couldn't. The tension between us was thick, heavier than I'd ever felt it before. Finally, he turned, his face unreadable. My problem? You think this is about me? I stepped closer, lowering my voice so the others wouldn't hear. Isn't it? Kenneth shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. And you really think everything's about you, don't you, Ben? You think I'm here to make your life harder? He stepped forward, his eyes locking with mine, that familiar intensity back. I'm here to make this team better. That includes you. If you can't handle that, then maybe you're not as ready as you think. I stared at him, my jaw clenched. Part of me wanted to snap back, tell him to shove it, but I couldn't. He was right, damn it. The problem wasn't just him, it was me too. Fine, I muttered, stepping back. Let's see if you can keep up. His eyes flickered with something pride, maybe, or a challenge. Either way, I wasn't going to be the one to back down. Not again. For the rest of practice, every time I caught his eye, it was a battle. The old feelings were there, buried under layers of anger, but they were there, and the worst part was, I could tell he felt them too. He just wasn't showing it. Yet, the locker room was almost empty when I finally finished up, and most of the guys had already hit the showers and left. I was glad for the quiet. I needed a moment to clear my head, but of course Kenneth wasn't about to let that happen. I was halfway through pulling off my jersey when I heard the door creak open. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. His footsteps were too familiar, too measured. Late again, Ben, he said, his voice softer than it had been on the field, but still carrying that edge. I sighed, tossing my shirt into my locker. I'm not late, just taking my time. Kenneth didn't respond right away. When I glanced over, he was leaning against the lockers, watching me like he was waiting for something. I could feel the weight of his stare on my bare back, and it made my skin crawl in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. You always did take your time, he said, a hint of something slipping into his voice. Nostalgia? Maybe, but I didn't want to think about that. I slammed the locker door shut. You need something, coach? Or are you just here to remind me how much I suck? He pushed off the lockers, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. Cut the sarcasm, Ben. I didn't come here to fight. Could have fooled me, I shot back, feeling the tension ratchet up a notch. My heart was racing, not from anger, but something else. Something I didn't want to admit. For a second, neither of us said anything. The silence was thick. The air between us charged with everything we weren't saying. I could feel the pull, like there was this invisible thread between us that hadn't snapped, no matter how hard I'd tried to cut it. Kenneth finally broke the silence. I didn't expect to see you again, he said, his voice quieter now, like he was saying it more to himself than to me. Not like this. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Neither did I. His gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, and when he looked up again, there was something softer in his eyes, something that made my chest tighten. You were always good at running, Ben? But you can't run forever. That hit deep, too deep. I didn't have a response to that, so I just stood there, fists clenched at my sides, trying to ignore the way my heart was pounding in my ears. I'm not running, I muttered, barely believing it myself. He took another step forward, close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating off him. Then prove it? I didn't move. Didn't say anything. We were standing too close, the line between the past and the present blurring in a way that had me dizzy. Kenneth's eyes lingered on mine for a second longer. Then he shook his head and turned, walking out without another word. As the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I leaned against the lockers, staring at the spot where he'd stood, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me. I was still in this, deeper than I wanted to be, and it was getting harder to pretend otherwise. A few days later, I arrived at the field early. I'd started doing that, hoping to avoid running into Kenneth before practice officially began, but as soon as I stepped out of the locker room, there he was already on the field, setting up drills. Of course he was. Morning, Ben, he called out, not even looking up from the cones he was laying out. His tone was casual, like we hadn't been exchanging tense words and awkward silences for the past week. Morning, I replied, keeping it short, moving toward the goalposts. I started stretching, trying to keep my distance, hoping he'd just leave it at that. But Kenneth wasn't exactly the type to leave things unfinished. He walked over, standing a few feet from me, hands on his hips. We don't have to make this awkward. I glanced up at him, raising an eyebrow. Awkward? You think this is awkward? He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, maybe that's an understatement. He paused, then looked directly at me. But it doesn't have to be like this. I'm serious, Ben. We can be friends. We don't need to ignore each other. I stood up straight, crossing my arms. Friends? After everything that happened between us? Kenneth nodded, his expression calm, maybe too calm. Yes, friends. It's not impossible, I snorted, shaking my head. It feels impossible. He stepped closer, the space between us shrinking. I get it. You think I haven't thought about this? About us? I have, and I don't want to keep holding on to the past. It's not doing either of us any favors. I looked away, staring at the empty field, the white lines marking the boundaries, wishing I could find some boundaries in my own head. You don't get it. It's not that easy to just let it go. Maybe not, he said softly, and I hated how his voice could still get to me like that. But it's a start. And we've got to start somewhere. I bit my lip, considering his words. And what, we just go back to being buddies? Like nothing ever happened. He gave a half smile, one that almost looked like the Kenneth I used to know. Not buddies, no, but we don't have to hate each other either. We were good together once, been on and off the field. That doesn't just disappear. I didn't know what to say to that. It felt like every part of me was pulling in different directions. But he was right. We couldn't keep dancing around this forever. Maybe friendship was the way forward, the only way we could both survive this situation without completely falling apart. All right, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Friends. Kenneth's smile widened, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a weapon. Friends. He held out his hand. For a second, I hesitated, but then I took it. His grip was firm, familiar, and for the briefest moment I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But I pushed that thought down, hard. Let's get to work, Kenneth said, releasing my hand and stepping back toward the field, his voice already slipping back into coach mode. I nodded, turning to follow him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite what we'd just agreed to, this was going to be anything but simple. The next few weeks were a strange rhythm of old familiarity and new distance. Kenneth and I didn't talk much outside of practice, but on the field things started to click again. The tension that had been choking the air between us eased, and slowly we fell back into a rhythm like we always had. One morning I showed up early as usual, expecting to have the field to myself. But when I stepped out onto the grass, I saw Kenneth already there, kicking a ball around, just like old times. "Beat you again," he said, flashing me a grin. It wasn't the cold, detached smile I'd seen the first few days. This was different, lighter. It reminded me of the way he used to smile when things were simpler. "I didn't know it was a competition," I replied, trying to sound casual, but the old pull between us was still there, hard to ignore. Kenneth jogged over, stopping just in front of me, the ball resting under his foot. "Everything's a competition, Ben. You should know that by now." I rolled my eyes, but a grin tugged at my lips despite myself. "Yeah, I remember." He kicked the ball to me, and before I knew it, we were passing it back and forth. No drills, no pressure, just us. It felt easy. Too easy. "You've been improving," he said after a while, his tone shifting from playful to serious. "On the field, you're faster than when we started." I shrugged, kicking the ball back to him. I guess I had a decent coach. He caught the ball with the inside of his foot, looking at me for a beat longer than necessary. "I don't give me too much credit. You've always had it in you." There was something in his voice that made me pause. I cleared my throat, trying to shake the sudden weight of his words. "Yeah, well, thanks." He smiled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've always believed in you, Ben, even back then." I stopped, the ball rolling to a halt between us. That familiar tension was back, creeping up my spine. He didn't need to say it. Back then meant more than just football. "I know," I muttered, kicking the ball harder than I intended. It sailed past him, but he didn't move to stop it. We both stood there, silence stretching between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. "Look," he said, finally breaking the silence. "I know things are complicated, but I meant what I said. I don't want this to be awkward between us." I turned to face him, arms crossed. "Yeah. And how's that working out for you?" He huffed a laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Could be worse. I mean, we're not trying to kill each other anymore, right? Guess that's progress." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "Ben, I'm serious. I've missed this. Even if it's just this." I swallowed, the words catching in my throat. I'd missed it too, more than I wanted to admit. But there was a line between us now, a line I wasn't sure I could cross without things getting messy again. "I know," I finally said, forcing myself to look at him, "but let's keep it simple. Just football. Okay?" He didn't respond right away, just nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, just football." But the way his eyes lingered on mine told me we were both lying. I was getting used to the early mornings with Kenneth, the quiet moments before the rest of the team showed up. It felt like old times, too much like old times if I was being honest with myself, but I wasn't ready to deal with that. Not yet. That morning I was tying my cleats when I heard a high-pitched voice cutting through the still air. My stomach dropped before I even looked up. "Benji, there you are." Catherine strutted across the field, heels clicking on the pavement, her outfit way too fancy for a football stadium. She was holding my smaller gym bag, swinging it like it was a purse. "You left this at the apartment," she chirped, planting a kiss on my lips before handing me the bag. I felt Kenneth's eyes on us, the tension from earlier snapping back into place. "Thanks," I muttered, barely making eye contact with her. Catherine, oblivious as always, beamed and turned to Kenneth. "Oh, you must be the new coach. Kenneth, right?" He nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, Kenneth Pratt. Nice to meet you. Ben's told me so much about you," she lied, flashing him one of her perfectly rehearsed smiles. Kenneth didn't say much, just nodded again, his eyes flicking between the two of us. "I better get going," she said, pulling out her phone. "I got to get some shots for Instagram. You know how it is." She kissed me again, lingering a little too long before walking off with a wave. "See you later, darling." As soon as she was out of sight, the silence between Kenneth and me was deafening. He hadn't moved, just stood there, watching her leave. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost tired. "So, you're in a relationship?" I swallowed, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, been together for a while now." Kenneth didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the ground, his jaw tight, with her. I felt a surge of defensiveness rise up, though I wasn't sure why. What's that supposed to mean? He looked up, his eyes harder now. "You don't even look at her, Ben. Not the way you used to. With me." I clenched my fists, my chest tightening. "This isn't about you, Kenneth. We're not, whatever we were before." He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not, but it doesn't change what's happening right now." I stepped forward, closing the gap between us. "What's happening as I moved on, okay? I have a life, a girlfriend, things are different now." Kenneth's eyes flickered with something, maybe hurt, maybe something else. "If that's what you call moving on." My throat tightened, and for a second I wanted to push him, make him feel as confused and angry as I did, but I couldn't. Not when his voice cracked like that. Not when the truth of his words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. "I've got practice," I muttered, turning away, trying to escape the mess I'd just walked into. But even as I jogged onto the field, I couldn't shake the look on Kenneth's face. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I'd moved on at all. A week passed and Kenneth had been distant, really distant. No more early morning chats, no quiet moments before practice. He'd been all business, all football. At first I told myself it was for the best, but it was messing with my head more than I wanted to admit. I was running laps after practice, trying to push the frustration out of my system, when Kenneth suddenly called out to me from across the field. His voice was sharp, cutting through the usual end-of-day noise. "Ben, we need to talk." I jogged over, my heart pounding harder than it should have been. Kenneth stood off to the side, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Something was off. "What is it?" I asked, wiping the sweat from my forehead, trying to keep my tone casual. He glanced around to make sure no one else was in earshot before speaking. "It's about Catherine." That caught me off guard. "What about her?" Kenneth took a deep breath, like he was trying to steady himself. "I saw her last night." I frowned, not understanding where this was going. "Okay?" "And?" With another guy, he continued, voice low. "Downtown. They were together, Ben. And it wasn't just friendly." My heart dropped into my stomach. I stared at him, the words not sinking in right away. "You're joking." "Ain." Kenneth shook his head, his eyes locked on mine. "I wouldn't lie to you about this." I wanted to laugh, tell him he was wrong, that he didn't know what he was talking about. But the look on his face, it wasn't smug. It wasn't angry. It was sincere, almost pained. "Catherine wouldn't. She's not like that," I muttered, but my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. Kenneth's gaze softened, but he didn't move. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I saw them, Ben. I wouldn't have said anything if I wasn't sure." I felt the ground shifting beneath me, everything I thought I knew about my relationship cracking at the edges. "Why are you telling me this now? Why not just let it go?" Kenneth's jaw tightened. "Because you deserve to know. And because, despite everything, I care about you, more than you think." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I took a step back, shaking my head, trying to push it all away. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, they were all hitting me at once. "You think this is going to change anything between us?" I spat, the words coming out harsher than I intended. "You think I'm going to fall into your arms just because you're the one who told me?" Kenneth flinched, but he didn't back down. "No, I'm telling you because you deserve better than someone who's lying to your face." I stared at him, my chest tight with so many emotions I couldn't even name them. "And you're the one who decides what's better for me. After all this time." "I'm not deciding anything for you," Kenneth said quietly. "I'm just giving you the truth. What you do with it is up to you." I didn't know how to respond to that. My mind was spinning, trying to piece everything together. Catherine, Kenneth, the mess that my life had become. Part of me wanted to accuse him of making it up, of trying to sabotage my relationship out of jealousy. But deep down, I knew Kenneth wouldn't lie about something like this. Not now, not after everything we'd been through. "I need to think," I muttered, turning away before I said something I couldn't take back. "I need to figure this out." Kenneth didn't stop me, didn't call after me. He just stood there, watching as I walked off the field, my thoughts a tangled mess of doubt, anger, and a painful truth I wasn't ready to face. I spent the next few days in a fog, my mind running in circles. I kept telling myself Kenneth was wrong. He had to be. But deep down, I couldn't shake the image of Catherine with someone else, the doubt growing like a knot in my chest. Every time I looked at her, I saw at her distance the way she'd stopped really seeing me, like I was just a part of her Instagram life, not her actual life. One evening, after another long, silent dinner, I couldn't take it anymore. "Catherine," I said, my voice strained, "we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, barely giving me a glance. "What's up, babe?" I took a deep breath, my hands clenched under the table. "I know about the guy." Her smile faltered and she blinked, confused. "What guy?" "The one Kenneth saw you with. Last night? Downtown." I didn't need to explain further. Her eyes widened just for a second, but that was all I needed. That split second of panic confirmed everything. She put the phone down, her voice suddenly defensive. "You're listening to him now. Your ex, Ben. Come on, you can't seriously believe." "Don't lie to me," I snapped, louder than I intended. The words felt sharp, jagged, cutting through the air between us. "I need the truth, Catherine. Just tell me the truth." For a moment she sat there staring at me, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then slowly she sighed, like the weight of keeping up the lie had finally gotten to her. "Okay, fine. Yeah, I've been seeing someone." My heart dropped, even though I'd known. Hearing her say it made it real, made it sting in ways I hadn't prepared for. "Why," I asked, my voice quieter now, almost breaking, "why didn't you just tell me?" She shrugged, like it was nothing, like our relationship hadn't just shattered in front of us. "I don't know, Ben. I guess we just drifted. You've been so focused on football, on everything else, and honestly, I haven't felt like we've really been together in a long time." I swallowed, the bitterness rising in my throat. "So you just moved on?" Catherine sighed, brushing a strand of hair out of face. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this, but yeah, I guess I did." The anger I'd been holding back surged forward. "You didn't mean for it to happen. You didn't mean to cheat on me." She flinched at the word cheat, but she didn't deny it. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? But I can't keep pretending we're good when we're done. Maybe this is for the best. I stared at her, feeling like the ground had opened up beneath me. It wasn't even about the cheating anymore. It was the way she said it, as a matter of fact. Like we were just a chapter in her life she was ready to close. And maybe we were. Fine, I muttered, standing up. Maybe it is for the best. She didn't try to stop me as I grabbed my jacket and walked out. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, but it didn't clear my head. My thoughts were spinning, a mess of anger, regret, and something else, something darker, something I didn't want to name. I found myself at the field, standing under the stadium lights, just staring at the empty space where I'd spent so many hours running drills, trying to keep everything in my life on track. Kenneth was right. He had been right all along, and I hated how much that truth burned. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I saw Kenneth's name on the screen, I hesitated for a second before answering. "I need to see you," I said, my voice barely steady. Kenneth's voice on the other end was calm, but I could hear the concern. "Meet me at the field. I'm already here." Of course he was. When I got to the field, Kenneth was already there, standing by the goalpost the way he always did. It felt like some twisted déjà vu, the place where everything began and now maybe where it would all unravel or come together. I wasn't sure which. He looked up as I approached, his face calm but guarded. "You okay?" I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "No, not really." He didn't say anything, just watched me with that steady gaze, waiting. I could tell he wasn't going to push me, wasn't going to make this about him. Not tonight. I ran a hand through my hair, pacing back and forth a few steps before finally blurting it out. "You were right. About Catherine." Kenneth's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Ben. I didn't want to be." I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek. "Yeah, well, you were." She admitted it, said we drifted apart, said it like it was nothing. The anger was still there, simmering under the surface, but more than that, I just felt empty, like everything I'd been holding on to slipped through my fingers. And I hadn't even realized it until it was too late. Kenneth stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "You didn't deserve that." She didn't know what she had. I glanced at him, the weight of his words settling in a way that made my chest tighten. "And what do I deserve, huh?" "I've made a mess of everything. My relationship, my career, you." I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Kenneth's gaze didn't waver. "You deserve better. And you know that." I stood there, feeling the silence stretch between us, thick with everything we hadn't said in years. The past we'd both been avoiding, the feelings we'd tried to bury. It was all right there, just waiting for one of us to make a move. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I admitted, my voice low. I thought I could just move on. That what we had was over. "But seeing you again, being around you, it's just," I stopped myself, but Kenneth was already shaking his head. "It's not over," he said, stepping even closer. "You think I came back here by accident?" I looked at him, confusion mixing with the emotions I was trying to keep in check. "What do you mean?" "I came back because I knew it wasn't over," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Not for me, and sure as hell not for you." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Kenneth, I. But before I could say anything else, he closed the space between us, his hand reaching up to cup the side of my face. The warmth of his touch sent a shock through my system. And suddenly, everything that had been building up, every unsaid word, every unresolved feeling came crashing down. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his eyes locked on mine. "Just don't run this time." I couldn't speak. The lump in my throat was too big, my chest too tight. So instead of talking, I closed the last bit of distance between us and kissed him. It wasn't like the last time. This wasn't about anger or frustration or trying to prove something. This was different, slower, softer, but no less intense. Like we were picking up where we left off, but this time we both knew what we were getting into. When we finally pulled apart, I didn't back away. Neither did he. "I'm not running," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Kenneth smiled, that familiar, crooked smile that used to drive me crazy. "Good. Because I'm not letting you this time?" We stood there for a moment, the world around us fading into the background. The floodlights cast long shadows on the empty field, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. This was a second chance, something I never thought I'd get, and this time I wasn't going to screw it up.